Frame time again, guys. We did the hard part, I think, of cutting all the pieces, joining all the edges, cutting the rabbets, sanding the inside edge or the surface on our frame. And now what we're gonna do is we gotta start to clean this whole thing together to make it look like a frame. And the thing that I do wanna mention to you that happens on this is all one take. It's not like I'm shooting and then I screw something up and then I revise it. As I screw it up, you're actually seeing it. So understand, and the thing that always bothered me whenever I read the woodworking magazines is they would go through this whole elaborate process of cutting this, joining this, squaring this, cutting this, and then just glue it all together. And that was the hardest part, is how do you glue this whole thing together so it goes together and the joints are tight? That's the part that I think that we really need help with. So when you get me describing what I'm doing, it's very similar to what I'm sure you guys are gonna run into. So number one, don't be discouraged as you work. The other thing is, number two, you're gonna become the innovator and solve problems, because when something doesn't work out, you kind of have to figure out a way. I'm sure you'll look around and go, hey, who can help me? Well, if you're not in the wood shop where a teacher's there and the teacher says, well, do this, it's gonna be you and your own bright mind. So you wanna look at that and say, how do I problem solve this? How would I do this the best way? Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't get it wrong. You get it wrong, but sometimes you just learn from the experience. So let's take a look at the two frames that I worked on the other day. Those two frames, I have one in the vise over there. I have one glued up. This is all together, ready to go, but you're probably noticing something different about this. I've got a clamp on there. I didn't have a clamp on there before. When I clamped it up and we left everybody the last time, the clamps were on the project. I broke it down, I cleaned it up by scraping it, using a chisel in the rabbet parts. But this clamp really wasn't meant to be there, and we'll discuss this a little bit. But what I want to do is show you some of the psychological parts of woodworking, things that have helped me over the years, which is coping and understanding. You just have to take things one step at a time. I have two frames, not one. When I worked on them and I cut the rabbets, glued the thing together, it was great. The thing that's not so great is when you think about, now I gotta sand this thing. Not only do I have to sand one, I have to sand two. So in your mind, you go, oh my goodness, I can't stand sanding. What's worse than watching someone sand is actually doing the sanding. So I'm gonna clean this one up a little bit and I'll take it to a certain point, and then what we'll do is I'll talk to you about some mistakes I've made as I go along here. Take a walk over here to the vise. And what you're gonna notice is I have my frame clamped up in the vise. And I have a choice. If you look at this, this is what was my surface, the outside surface. Remember, I didn't have my board on its surface, I had it on its edge. So it looked like this. It didn't look like this. If I had glued my project together so that the surface was facing up and this was the largest area, I would probably sand this area first. But if you look at my frame, which is similar to this one, this area, you would normally say it's the edge, but it's actually the outside surface. This surface is the largest area. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna tack this one first. The other thing that I'm gonna do is decide which part do I wanna do, the long side or the short side. I always do the worst. Do the worst first. So I'm gonna do the long surface, that outside surface first with my sanding. Take a look here, and I broke this down into 5 different abrasives that I like to use. If it's really, really rough, if the material that I'm working with is really, really tough, what I would probably do, and I think I put it away. I had a piece of 60 grit abrasive paper over here. Really, really rough stuff, might use 60 grit. Or if I have a material like oak, which is hard as nails. I do have cherry that I'm working with, and every other wood, and most of the time oak, you can get away with a piece of 80 grit. And how I try to describe to my students about understanding these grits and these numbers on the back has to do with just make believe that everything is measured by a square inch. So if we take an inch and we square this up, thought I had my pencil, of course I put it down on the table. If I take a square inch here, The way I think about it is I have a number, this P80. It's referring to, in my mind, the fact that I have 80 grits per square inch. That's the way I look at it. So here's 80 grit. I move on to the next grit, 120 grit. And if you take that same 1 inch mark, there's more grits on this piece than there are on that piece, almost 1.5 times. So I say, here's a piece of 120 grit. The next grit that we like to use is a grit of 220 grit. And most of the time I'll say to people, that's probably enough unless you do this one time. And if you work with a piece of 400 grit and finally a piece of 600 grit, you never really go back to ending at 220 because 220 is going to feel a certain way. 400 and 600 are really going to polish the wood. And the beauty of it is you're not sanding the same amount with 600 as you do 80. I always tell people you gotta fall in love with a piece of 80 grit. 80 grit is what you want to use to get all your scratches out, your burn marks, any kind of deformities in this wood. 80 grit will take care of it. If you get spoiled by a piece of 600 grit because you sand something and it feels super smooth and you go, wow, hey, that's great. I could just use 600 grit. It's gonna leave saw marks, scratches, grit lines. Any of those deformities will be left if you use a piece of 600 grit. So I'm gonna start with a piece of 400 grit. When I do this, there's no mystery to sanding and how to effectively sand. I cannot pull out my easy chair, sit down, yeah, let's do this. Because I get people doing this all the time. And they're gonna sand their wood, so they're gonna get all comfortable. And then they start sanding like this. This is the recipe for, oh, this is gonna be about a 4.5-month job. I get this a lot where people go like this and they're sanding, and I don't really feel, you know, it's hot in here, it's kind of hot. I don't really feel like doing this. And they hyperventilate a little. No. It's a job. You got to get it done. The only way you're going to get this thing sanded is if you physically do it. Again, look around. There's no line forming in the back of people who are dying to sand your piece of wood. So you're going to grab this. I always, as I told you before, fold abrasives in thirds so I don't have paper on paper so it slides. I'm going to take my abrasive paper and I'm going to start moving my hands and creating friction. There is no mystery to this. But I will also tell you some of the mistakes. I mentioned to you guys about sanding a long piece of wood, straddling the wood, pushing down, and having the back go up. On a frame like this, it becomes a difficult task because this side's been rounded over. So when I clamp this down, and the other thing is, I just have a small little 1/4-inch rabbet that I'm clamping into the vise. So unless the vise wood is really sharp, it's going to be difficult sometimes to sand this without this frame flipping out of the vise. When I did it on my first one, that's exactly what happened. This, I dropped it a little bit lower in the vise so it's staying in place, but I'm not pushing as hard here as I am where the vise is, because where the vise is the support. So when I do this, I'm going to sand that surface. You notice the dust that's flying off of this. What I also try to do is put my index finger on that edge. So I'm breaking that edge slightly. I don't need to round it over. I just want to break it slightly so that it doesn't cut me as often happens. Does that mean it's time? I'm done sanding? No, just the school bell. I'll sand, and if I look at this, I'm critically looking at this. I don't really see any saw marks, plane marks. When I was planing the miter, it looks pretty good. So how long did I sand that for? I'm gonna probably guess about 2 minutes or so. I could ask cameraman, because cameraman keeps close radio contact with me with time. But I feel a little sweat build up, and I think I'm done. I'm gonna take my 80 grit, put it down, get a piece of 120 grit. Do it the same exact way. And if you want, you could time me, because I guarantee I sand less with this 120 grit than I sanded with 80. And I have a sneaking suspicion that I'm gonna sand, oh, you see how that frame came up a little bit? Doesn't mean I didn't do my push-ups today, folks. Maybe I should slide this over when I'm doing this side. Oh, there's a smart move. So there's 120 grit. Remember, I did that surface already. I did this over here already. I'm now going to move to 220 grit. And I mentioned to you in an earlier video that when you get into the abrasives of 220, 400, and 600, the thickness of the paper that they use is not nearly as thick as it is with 80 and 120. I'm just going to slide this over so I don't get any surprises. So it's easy that you could take a piece of 400 grit and do this. Out! Yeah. Oh man, I just burned my fingers because the abrasive is so thin. How can I prevent that from happening? I can have somebody else sand my wood. That ain't gonna happen though. How about if I did this? How about if I take a little piece of cardboard? Snap. I take the cardboard, I put it in my 400 grit, and guess what? It gives a little as I sand because there's air in that cardboard, and it shields me from coming in contact with that abrasive and with the heat that's generated on its surface because of the friction. So here's a piece of 400 grit, sand away. Last thing, 600 grit. I'm just going to take my 600, put it right on top of everything. And if you notice with 600 grit, my sanding is down in seconds. And do you think that's smooth? Whoa, geez, holy Hannah, is that smooth? It's less with 120 than it was with 80. Less with 220 than it was with 120. Less with 400 than 220. Less with 600 than 400. So if I feel this now, I wish we had feel-o-vision, but that right there feels really good. The other thing I can do is I can take the compressor, blow the dust off. So now, I have 12 parts that I have to sand. I have to sand this outside surface, this one, and this one. Notice the sawdust is coming out of there, so I did do a job of abrading this. If I feel this, I go 12 serves, I did one, I'm 1/12 of the way done. Oh no! Oh no! What did we already sand? We already sanded these inside surfaces before we glued everything together. So miraculously, I have gone from being 1/12 of the way done, almost halfway done now, because I am 5 out of the 12 surfaces. So now if I take this and sand this with 80, 120, 220, 400, 600, I'm going to be halfway done with this. So the only thing I have to do is this surface, and then the outside edges, and I'll be completely done. I don't want to bore you with that. I'll bore you with something else. I'm gonna leave that here because mentally now I feel a heck of a lot better than I did before when I started thinking of how daunting a task this is. That's a good word, daunting. Come over here. Let's take a look at what happened before. So many times I'll tell people grain runs in two directions. Grain is either running this way or this way, but grain also tends to angle down or angle in this direction. When I was sanding this piece, and I know it's happened to many people, especially in my class, if you start sanding a piece of wood and you get underneath the grain, in this case, it's the grain on the edge. I was sanding with a piece of 120 grit, and all of a sudden the 120 grit went underneath the grain. It actually lifted the grain up, and the abrasive paper went underneath there. So now I look at it and I go, oh boy, that screws everything up. Again, here's where you have to think of yourself as, how can I make this work? So this part of the wood was lifted up from this surface. Here's my choices. I could take this, I could rip that off. I could take a chisel, rip it off. But the problem is that's the outside edge that you're gonna see on this whole frame. So everybody looks at it and sees it. I didn't want that to happen because by the time I sanded it, it's gonna leave a little indent in there. So what I decided to do was take a piece of abrasive paper, lift up that grain, and I slid some of this glue underneath it. Not a whole lot, just a little bit. And then what I did was I pulled the abrasive paper out and I put a deep throw clamp on this. So I did this probably about 20-25 minutes ago. And if you notice, you could see my edge, but you could also see the glue that's on here. This entire frame has all been sanded because, like I said, I wanted to move on to the next step so I don't bore you. But these are real world issues that could happen. If that happens to you, you have to make the decision. Sometimes it's better just to pull out the chip and be rid of it if you're not going to see it a lot. But if you are, like my case, I lifted it up, glued it back into place. So now I have to clean up this area. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take this frame, I'm going to put it back into the vise. There is glue on there. I don't know if you guys can see this, but I can notice that it's definitely yellow. And if it's yellow, when I go to put a finish on this, it's not going to take over that glue. So I have to sand down to that level. So what grit should I start with? 600 grit? No, you're smarter than that. I'm going to start with my 80 grit. And all I want to do is clean up this little area. So that's what it looks like. And let's see if I can make it any better. When you do this, as I said before, I'm sanding it, I'm blending it out, and I'm going to try to make this look like it's part of that edge or that surface that you're looking at. So if you look at that, and let me get my glasses on so that I can take a look at it. Yeah, that's the grain right there. Like there is that imperfection there, or maybe I should say perfection, because we all know that God does not make a mistake. But when I sand this, I'm sanding it with 80 grit to even it out, and then I'll move on to my 120 grit. .220, and then my 400 grit. Now the good part about this is that grain didn't lift up, but that is definitely in the wood, and I can't make that any better. How do I solve this problem? You want me to tell you how you do it? I have two frames. One for my son who doesn't call, who never asks how I'm doing, who never is concerned about me, who never tries to make my life any better, doesn't ever ask about how my job is, my health. Perhaps this is his frame. Oh yes, because that one over there that came out really nice, maybe is for my daughter who's compassionate, caring, always calling, always checking to see how are you doing, how's the job, how's your health. Maybe we'll give that one to her and we'll give this one to him. Well, what we'll do is we'll work on finishing this. and then we'll talk about who gets what. Right now, that's as good as I'm gonna get. The other thing I wanna check out is that if I got any glue on that inside surface, which I didn't, I could feel this. That is just the natural look of the wood. Just to be on the safe side, I'm gonna hit this with a little 120, even though I sanded it already. I just wanna make sure I don't have any glue on that. Hit that with a little 220, little 400, and I'm good to go here. Before you guys joined me, what I did was I took the compressor, I blew all the dust off of this. If I wanted to, I can blow the dust off of that area, but I'm always gonna have that mark. And you know what that mark is? Something that you could talk about. So there's my mark right there, and I'm just gonna live with it. See how it looks when I finish it. Talk about finishing, how about if I finish this? You guys interested in me putting some oil on this? Tell you the truth, yeah, the cameraman just gave a big head nod, no good. I don't wanna put oil on this because I know for a fact that these frames are gonna be hanging up in a wall, on a wall, or if you don't like them, they could be in a wall. They're gonna be hanging up on the wall. Of course, you're gonna have dust and everything accumulate, and oil will just draw that dust to it. So when I'm making my decisions for finishing, it's cherry, so I don't want to stain it. I want to let the beauty of the cherry kind of shine through. The other thing is I want a sealing finish that's going to provide me with an area where I can just wipe off the dust with a cloth. So I want to use some polyurethane. So we like to use a water-based polyacrylic Minwax polyurethane. I think it does a real nice job. It gives a nice finish. The other thing about that polyacrylic, the water-based polyurethanes dry so much quicker than the oil-based. Years ago, I used to use Minwax oil-based, and it would take 4 or 5 hours to dry on a good day. Well, on a day like today where it's sunny and beautiful out, and I'll probably do this inside anyway, I'm gonna put a coat of polyurethane, and I could probably put 3 coats of polyurethane within an hour and wax this bad boy up, which is what I'm planning to do. You guys want to follow me in the back? I got my brush and we'll polyurethane. And there is, again, a method to his madness. A reason why he's going to do it a certain way. Let's take a look. I always put these little ledger boards down to make sure that when I polyurethane, I'm not polyurethaning on a solid tabletop. If I did that and the polyurethane dripped around this outside surface, and it made contact with the tabletop, that tabletop would be part of my picture frame. So I don't want to do that, so I always put those ledger boards on there. Again, I told you a little story about me dropping a can of polyurethane without a pair of safety glasses. So I'm going to put on a pair of safety glasses when I do this. The reason why I don't use glasses when I'm sanding is because a lot of times when I sand, I build up some sweat and my glasses will fog up. So I tend not to do it when I'm using abrasive paper, but I will use it when I'm polyurethaning. So here's my polyurethane, here's the polyacrylic, here's the brush that I'm gonna use, and let's talk about sequence here. Here's the story. When I do this, just like when I sand, I like to do the longer sections first. And the other thing that I wanna do is I wanna do the inside surface first. I want to do the inside surface, then I'm going to do the outside edge, then I'm going to do the outside surface on one side of this. So let's see how I do this. As I tell people all the time, I'm taking the tips of the bristles, I'm putting it in the polyurethane, it drips. But if I touch it to the inside of the container, miraculously, it will stop. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the polyurethane on that inside surface. And you notice immediately there's a color change. So that color looks a heck of a lot darker and more defined. Let me do this on that outside edge. And again, I call it an outside edge because it is. No, because I'm not using the majority of wood grain on the outside. I'm using the edge of the board. So there's my outside edge, there's my outside surface. You also notice something about those splines. Those splines really define so much better than this side that hasn't been polyurethaned. So you could clearly see the distinct difference in the color. And that's the beauty of cherry. Cherry will definitely darken with age. Anytime I used to make my make projects for my wife when I was in love with her, that was many years ago. Well, I don't want to get into it right now. This isn't Dr. Phil, right? Of course. But when I used to make her projects, I used to always choose cherry because I always thought it was the warmest wood, always so sensitive, just like this old shop teacher, chortle. As I have gotten older, I've noticed when I look back at the projects I've already made, it's hard to recognize that they're cherry simply because they darken up. The other thing that's amazing is years ago, and notice how I'm doing this. I do one side, hold it, then I'll do that side, I'll do this side. This very last one, you might have an issue. I'm just gonna put that down and I'll polyurethane that pretty easily that way. But years ago, when I was starting out, I remember making oak kitchen cabinets. And oak kitchen cabinets were the thing. If you had oak kitchen cabinets, it was like, oh my goodness, wow, they're oak. And if anybody had painted cabinets, they threw them out because they were simply painted cabinets. Ugly. Guess what? We are now into the age of white and gray. Painted cabinets are back. Oak cabinets are out. I had a friend who was selling his house. He had beautiful oak cabinets and he couldn't sell the house. The real estate agent said to him, paint them white and you'll sell the house in no time. So now I'm not holding anything. I put the frame down on the ledger boards. I'm going to continue doing the inside edge first, or actually the inside surface. Then I'll do the outside edge. And here's the other thing that I guess I really want to show you. Come over here. This is what you want to avoid. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen, is that when you do this, you are going to put on many thin coats. It is not a situation where I put one thick coat on and pray that I don't get any drips. Put a thin coat on. After I put a thin coat on, I just want to double check that I did that inside. This has one complete coat of polyurethane on it. So if I look at this and examine everything that I did on the inside, I don't think it looks bad. But I have to wait for this to dry. So in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash my brush. I told you this is water-based polyurethane. So I'll run this under the sink so it doesn't stiffen up. Before I do that, I'm going to take the brush. I just touch it on the side, so any excess polyurethane will drip back into the can. Put the lid on this. I'll take this down and I'll wash it out and I'll check to see how it feels. I got a feeling it's not going to feel too good. Then what I'll do is, in the meantime, go back to that other frame, sand that up, see if I can get these two frames done. Any questions, feel free to give me shoot me an email. I don't answer a phone, but feel free to comment or ask a question on email. I'll be happy to answer your question. Again, the question for today. Yeah. The question for today is, what are the 5 grits of abrasive paper you're going to progressively sand with? What grit first, second, third, fourth, fifth? You name me all 5 of those grits. You should know it, and if you sand in that order and fall in love with the first grit that you use, your project's going to come out pretty well. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.